I want to keep my baby had good intentions, but I think this film was really badly executed, and something pretty dramatic happens at one point with no repercussions. And I will, with a spoiler warning, explain what that is in a little bit, but for now, this will be spoiler-free. This was released in 1976. It's directed by Jerry Thorpe and written by Joanna Lee, and it stars Mariel Hemingway as Sue-Ann. We also have Rhea Perlman playing a character called Ray, and I only became aware of this because of Rhea Perlman. And she's in a decent amount, so if you're curious to watch it because of Perlman, that's not too bad. I think you'll enjoy her role in this. Sue-Ann is a 15-year-old girl who becomes pregnant, and she has the baby pretty quickly, pretty early on in the film. The bulk of the film is about her, well, in theory, about her trying to raise the baby, making it on her own as a 15-year-old, not living at home. I won't go into too much detail about the circumstances, but I do think things would be very different today. This is, of course, mid-70s. And we don't really see her interacting with the baby very much. And I don't mean she leaves the baby to cry or anything. I mean, the scenes that we see don't feature the baby that much. So we don't actually get to see the struggles of her bonding with the baby. Occasionally we'll see her struggling with the baby crying, but we don't really get to see her interacting with the baby very much at all. And honestly, we don't really get to see any of the problems. The main issue she had was living with some people who were maybe not the nicest. That was the biggest struggle she faced. And I think it's a really unrealistic portrayal of what it would be like to be a young mother trying to make it on her own. We don't see the emotional struggles. She just seems to be emotionally numb for most of it. There are times when she gets a little overwhelmed, and I'll talk about that in a moment with a spoiler warning, but for the most part, she just doesn't seem to have any emotions. And that's no disrespect to the performance. I think the performance is fine. I just think the scenarios, the dialogue she has with other characters, there's just no emotion there. And it makes it seem like not necessarily an easy experience, but one where you're not going to really feel many negative things. And again, I think it's a really inaccurate, irresponsible portrayal of this kind of situation. And the actual events within the film are very, very boring. Nothing happens. Apart from occasionally she'll meet some characters who are not that nice and she has to try and find somewhere else to live. There's a little bit of her going back to school, which I think is really admirable. I think that was a really great thing for the film to include. But other than that, nothing happens. Not much happens, apart from a spoiler that happens towards the end. And again, I'll mention that in a moment, but it's not portrayed very well at all either. So honestly, it's a pretty terrible narrative. And while I don't think Sue-Ann is unlikable, in fact, I think she's quite a likable character, she has no emotions for the bulk of the film. So it doesn't really have anything to offer. It's a great concept. Any film showing the struggles of being a young parent is a great thing, because while some people can do well as young parents, it's not exactly going to be an ideal situation, particularly if you don't necessarily have the right kind of support. And this is what happens with Sue-Ann. And they could have done so many things with this to really show the emotional struggle, the financial struggle, and they just did a terrible job with it. So it's not a good narrative. Nothing happens, and I don't think it's an accurate representation. So what does it have to offer? Honestly, nothing. And I will now explain the spoiler that happens towards the end. And I understand what they were going for, but I don't think they did in fact, again, I think it's pretty irresponsible. So this is a big spoiler for something that happens towards the end. This is the last thing I have to say about the film. Do I recommend it? It's not bad in the sense that it was unwatchable. It's just bad in the sense that I think it's irresponsible and inaccurate. But it is watchable. So if you're interested in any of the cast, I'd say check it out for the cast. I enjoyed Rhea Perlman in this, but as a story, it's terrible in a lot of ways. So I will now explain what happens towards the end. And towards the end, the baby, a little girl called Elizabeth, is crying and crying and crying. And they should have done so much more with this, because basically it was an easy ride for Sue-Ann up until this point. We didn't see any of the struggles of looking after a newborn baby. And by this point, I'm not sure how old Elizabeth is. She's not a newborn, but Sue-Ann is still 15. So I'm not entirely sure of the passage of time. She could technically still be 15. But I don't think Elizabeth is only 3 months old. She looks quite a bit older than 3 months, so I don't know how much time has passed, but I don't think it's accurate. That's my least concern with the film, though. Sue-Ann is really, really frustrated and stressed that Elizabeth will not stop crying. I think it's a pretty believable response to the situation for once. And she picks Elizabeth up and she shakes her. And then the baby is immediately put up for adoption. That's not what happens when you shake a baby. If you shake a baby, they are very likely to die. And then what we see is Elizabeth being shaken. She's perfectly fine. And then she can just go and get adopted and start a new life. And basically the message is, if you get frustrated, don't worry. You can shake your baby and then send them to live with a new family. That's not acceptable. And also, it's suggesting that if you get a little bit frustrated with your baby, the only solution is to give them up for adoption. And that's also not realistic or believable as well. And I think it's an exceptionally irresponsible way to tell the story of a young girl struggling with her baby. It's very irresponsible to say that you can shake your baby and then they're perfectly fine. Because I don't have the statistics. I don't know if there are any stats on how many babies have been shaken but survived, because I imagine that would be difficult information to find. But there are many cases of shaken babies who die from shaken baby syndrome. Poorly executed, irresponsible narrative with a very unrealistic portrayal of the struggles that a young girl would face, either in the 70s or today. So there is nothing about this that worked well. Sue-Ann was a likeable character, but she was emotionless for most of the film. So I can't recommend it. If you like any of the cast, it is watchable, but I feel like it's a terrible portrayal of this kind of story. And the cast aside, there's nothing about this that I could recommend.